where Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were priests to the Lord. Each time Elkanah offered his sacrifice, he would give one share of the meat to Peninnah and one share to each of her children. And even though he loved Hannah very much, he would give her only one share because the Lord had kept her from having children. Peninnah, her rival, would torment and humiliate her because the Lord had kept her childless. This went on year after year. Whenever they went to the house of the Lord, Peninnah would upset Hannah so much that she would cry and refuse to eat anything. Her husband Elkanah would ask her, "Hannah, why are you crying? Why don't you eat? Why are you always so sad? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" One time after they had finished their meal in the house of the Lord at Shiloh, Hannah got up. She was deeply distressed and she cried bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. Meanwhile, Eli the priest was sitting in his place by the door. Hannah made a solemn promise. "Lord Almighty, look at me, your servant. See my trouble and remember me. Don't forget me. If you give me a son, I promise that I will dedicate him to you for his whole life and that he will never have his hair cut." Hannah continued to pray to the Lord for a long time, and Eli watched her lips. She was praying silently. Her lips were moving, but she had no sound, so Eli thought that she was drunk. And he said to her, "Stop making a drunken show of yourself. Stop your drinking and sober up." "No, I am not drunk, sir," she answered. "I haven't been drinking. I am desperate. I've been praying, pouring out my troubles to the Lord. Don't think that I am a worthless woman. I have been praying like this because I am so miserable." "Go in peace," Eli said. May the God of Israel give you what you have asked him for." "May you always think kindly of me," she replied. And she went away, ate some food, and was no longer sad. "I am not a worthless woman," she tells Eli. "I am praying because I am desperate." Hannah becomes the mother of Samuel, we learn later. Samuel, the great prophet, the one who anoints David, the one who advises him when he is king. His story starts, like many stories of the great heroes of the Bible, with a woman who cannot have children. The story of women who can't bear children is a motif that is used repeatedly throughout Scripture. Sarah cannot have children. Rachel cannot have children. All of these women bear children who will change the face of the history of their people. But it starts in a place of despair and loss and grieving. And like each of these motifs, the women pray and weep and cry and grieve their loss. And they hit a place where they no longer can bear even trying to pretend that anything is good in their lives. And they become so despondent and lost. And their prayers are suddenly heard by God. And their wombs are open. And they bear a child. The story of Hannah bearing this child is often put against, of course, the story of Jesus being born. Right? We often hear these stories together. And later, Hannah is going to sing a hymn of praise to God that is very similar to the Magnificat, which we hear at Christmas time. But this story of a despondent woman, this woman who has gotten to the very end of any rope that she ever had, is a story of all of us. You don't have to be a woman to understand this story, because this is the story of when we reach that place in our lives where we feel we can no longer go on. It might be because of the death of a beloved partner, or the death of a child, or the loss of a job that defined who we were. It could be any great marker in our lives. And there's a moment when we think to ourselves, that's it. I can't go on anymore. I'm done. I'm completely done. God, do with me as you will. Hannah reaches that place. But what's interesting about it is that when she gets down there, somewhere deep in the very bottom of her being, Hannah finds strength. There's a strange little twist in the story. Instead of simply laying down and dying and forgetting about life, Hannah makes a different choice. Now you see, in her tradition, because she's a barren woman, Elkanah, her husband, could cast her out. He could simply tell her to leave the camp. She is no longer wanted as a wife. He has a wife who can produce children. He doesn't need Hannah. And there may be some argument that the honorable thing for her to do as a woman who cannot bear children is to simply walk out into the desert. For she brings nothing but shame to her family. And there are times sometimes in our lives where we feel that that might be us, the one who brings too much shame to our family. Maybe we've been the one who's had an addiction. And our families are ashamed to have us around. Or we've said something or done something so awful that maybe we've ended up in jail. And there's places of shame in our family, and we don't want to be around. In fact, they don't want us around. And it would be simply better to walk off into the desert and die. But Hannah makes a different choice in this story. Hannah somehow digs deep into her very being and finds her voice. And she speaks up. When Eli accuses her of drunkenness, instead of meekly accepting the authority voice of the priest and leaving, Hannah is so done with it all that she turns around to Eli and says, I am not drunk. I'm desperate. I'm absolutely desperate. I sometimes think when I read this passage that Eli suddenly gets this look of horror and terror on his face. Because, she's speaking back. She speaks back to him and she says, I'm desperate. I need God's help. That's why I've been praying so fervently. And somewhere inside her, she has found strength to face all of her adversaries. She's found the strength where she knows she's going to go back to the family camp and she is not going to put up with Peanut anymore. She is not going to put up with that. She's not going to put up with the teasing and the bullying. She's not going to do that anymore. Because she has realized in her desperate prayers that God hears her and that God will speak something to her. She does not know what it will be. She, of course, is still praying for this child, but she suddenly realizes in that moment of desperation that she is not alone in that space, that there is a God who will be with her, and that God will walk with her regardless of whether she has a child or not. She will know God's presence. In her fervent praying, she has realized that God is very real for her, and that God is there, walking with her, being with her. And because she knows that, she suddenly has the strength to speak. She has the strength to speak to Eli, the priest, and tell him that he's got it all wrong. And you know that she's going to have the strength to speak to Pinna now when she gets back to camp. That girl is not getting away with that anymore. And she will have the strength to speak to Elkanah, her husband, and tell him of her despair, and tell him of her brokenness. And in the telling of all of this, Hannah starts to heal. She has become so open to the presence of God in this moment that, in fact, instead of breaking her, she has turned her life around into a place of healing. Some of us might not be able to imagine a depth of desperation like that. A depth of desperation where really there are only two choices: to give up or to believe that God is present. To believe that God is with us. To trust in a presence that is beyond our imagination and beyond our knowing, who will not abandon us even in these horrible and desperate times. Some of us may never feel we're ever going to experience that moment. But most of us have what they call the dark night of the soul moment. There's a moment in our lives when something happens and we have to make a choice. We have to decide whether to give up or whether to trust that God is there. And that although things may not change, for Hannah does not know that this what will happen. Although things may not change, we actually are not going through this alone. That God has made God's presence known to us, whether it's through friends and family or a stranger who smiles at us in the street. That God has made God's presence known. And that the only thing left for us really to do is trust and hope. The passages for the last few weeks have been a lot about that. They've been about trusting and hoping in desperate times, when we don't know what's on the other side. And that's where sometimes faith kind of hits the road. It's where we suddenly realize that we have a faith. We've come to church for years. You know, it's been a habit. It's something we do, right? And then that thing happens. And we suddenly realize that the ritual of simply turning up becomes the faithful moment where we realize that actually, yeah, God is here for me. God has put the person in the pew beside me there for a reason today. God has made God's self known to me in the love of others. That's a powerful moment if we're able to grasp it. It's a powerful, in fact, it's almost overwhelmingly powerful. So much so that lots of people will turn away and go, no, that's never happening in my life. That's too much. Because the funny thing is when God gets in there, life does change. And it changes significantly. It becomes a whole different thing. Now, our troubles don't always go away. That was always one of the really interesting arguments I used to have, or I often do have with people who are not people of faith. You've probably had that argument as well. People will tell you they don't go to church because what's the point? God doesn't change anything. You know, people still die. People still lose their jobs. People still get addictions. But what changes, and this is the hard thing often to express to somebody who doesn't have a faith, what changes is I change. I change because God is with me and I have learned to trust in a different place. I change, you change, because God is present. We suddenly, like Hannah, find the strength to speak. Like Hannah, we find the strength to turn around and say, you know what? No, I am not worthless. I'm not a worthless person. I'm worth something because God has heard me. And God may not answer my prayers in the way I want, but God has heard me. And I realized I'm not worthless. We're not worthless. God has heard us. God has heard you in the quiet, dark moments of the soul. And you are not worthless. And we change. And we pick ourselves up from that place and we turn around. And we start to face whatever is going on. But now we know we're not facing it alone. And we may not change the circumstances of what's going on, but at least we're not alone anymore. We're walking with God. Now Hannah gets her prayers answered, because otherwise there'd be no story, right? There'd be no Samuel. There'd be no anointing of David. But the funny thing is when the story carries on, Hannah follows through on her promise. She gives this little 3-year-old boy to the priests as an offering, that he may be raised in faith. And he will become the great prophet. He will change things. He will raise David up to be king, and the great Davidic line that for us is important because Jesus is of it. That great Davidic line is raised up. We don't know what will happen or change when we choose to acknowledge that God is ever present and walking through our lives with us. We just know that it will change. And it will change because God loves us. And God cares for us. And God offers comfort to us. Hannah says to Eli, I am not a worthless woman. And we are not worthless. We are not worthless people, for God loves us too.